So let's get into it. All right. All right, can everybody see my slide deck? Okay, great. So my topic today is providers coping with mass violence. Um, it should be abundantly clear why this topic is being addressed, but if not, you're in luck. I'm going to give a whole presentation on it. So first off, who is this talk for and what is it about? So this talk is intended to give information on mass violence. So what it is and how it can impact us as healthcare providers, along with education, coping skills, tips, and resources to better manage the impacts of mass violence for ourselves and those we provide care for. As healthcare workers, we are on the front line of human suffering and trauma, which leaves us vulnerable to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So thus, self-care is essential for us providers. And I also like to set the tone. I like to give my non-trigger warning. This talk will not show images of violence or weapons. The media has this covered, and my intention is not for people to walk away from this talk with more vicarious trauma. So how common is violence? So the CDC themselves has stated that injuries and violence are the leading cause of death in the United States. So directly from their website, injuries and violence affect everyone, regardless of age, race, or economic status. In the first half of life, more Americans die from injuries and violence, such as motor vehicle incidences, suicide, or homicide, than from any other cause, including cancer, HIV, or influenza. So this makes injury the leading cause of death among people in the US, and that includes all of us here. So what is mass violence? So the definition for this talk, mass violence is being used as an umbrella term to describe when someone causes harm to four or more persons in a public space. And that's taken from the FBI and the Center for Victim Research. The US Secret Service refers to the mass violence more specifically as mass attacks in public spaces involving three or more victims. So mass violence, for the definition of this talk, it includes shootings, vehicular violence, detonating explosives, and other acts of terrorism. So now this is kind of where my opinion comes in. Some instances of mass violence can be framed as a type of domestic terrorism, as they instill terror and fear in a community. So as psychotherapists, this framework can help some of us understand the impacts of mass violence in terms of post-traumatic stress on a group scale. So what needs to be stated? Guns in America. So mass violence can take many forms, as I had just described on the last slide, and its most common form in the US is gun violence and mass shootings. That's just the reality. I'm not trying to take a political stance, I'm just stating facts. So as of this morning, 524 mass shootings have happened in the United States this year, resulting in 509 deaths and 2,178 injuries. And the source for this is the Gun Violence Archive, which there's a hyperlink in my slides here if anyone wants to check that website out. So we have more registered guns than people in the United States, and therefore many people live with guns in or around their home. It's ubiquitous in our culture. As said, firearms are steeped in our culture, and think of all of the gun-related idioms we use just in everyday language. Like, for example, lock and load, to be prepared, calling shotgun, sticking to your guns, pull the trigger on a situation, being triggered, saying I've got you on my crosshairs, being bulletproof, feeling the kickback of a situation, jumping the gun, coming out guns a-blazing, shooting me an email, fire away to begin something, shoot from the hip, being a straight shooter, being under the gun, asking if a gun was held to one's head, being shot out of the sky, having an arsenal instead of just saying a collection of things, and so on. So, before we continue, if anyone else has any other of these idioms, feel free to put them in the chat box because, again, it's ubiquitous in our culture, and cultures typically draw from the language itself. We use predominantly English in this country, even though we don't have an official language, and American English has many idioms related to glorifying and identifying under gun culture. So with all this fun stuff I'm bringing to the table, who is at risk of mass violence? Well, the disheartening truth is that anyone who attends mass gatherings or goes into public spaces or businesses, I should add, can be at risk. So, according to the Violence Project, another wonderful resource on gun violence, they state that 31% of mass shootings in its database occurred in workplaces, followed by retail sites, restaurants, schools overall, and the mass majority of workplace shooters were inside of an organization. So, as healthcare professionals, we're at significant risk, especially if we provide in-person services at our workplaces. Professors in particular are at risk if they teach in person at universities. And an added bonus, I guess, psychotherapists who do pastoral counseling, they're also at significant risk because sanctuaries and places of worship are already at significant risk for mass violence. So, what are some of these specific risks to us as healthcare providers? Well, think about this. And we can also save the responses for the Q&A section at the end. Just think about it. How do we treat potentially violent folks with compassion, understanding, good ethics, boundaries, and safety? So chew on that. And as mentioned by Dr. Kalman, there's the fear of being stalked or the fear of being killed at work. It's significant for healthcare providers, especially if we work with those who are prone to violent acts, which I'm just thinking of Dr. Kalman's caseload. People with chronic emotional dysregulation and affect dysregulation, it brings up these question marks. But nevertheless, there is a legal obligation to keep patient information private. And there's another obligation to give a potentially impacted community some warning. So we'll expand on that in a few slides from now too. So healthcare providers need to think about how to review cases where violence might come up and protect our own and other patients and professionals' lives. Some of the other risks, of course, which have been mentioned by my two predecessors today and just should always bear repeating, vicarious trauma. As psychotherapists, we are very prone to vicarious trauma, and this can happen as a risk to all of this mass violence in our culture. Vicarious trauma left unchecked, and if self-care techniques are not employed by a psychotherapist, we then run the significant risk again for burnout and compassion fatigue, which is really not fun. If anyone's experienced that, I'm sure they could vouch that burnout and compassion fatigue are not fun to lead to. So specifically for us psychotherapists, what about violence in our practice? So some tips for this are definitely research your group or your clinic's EAP program for your own treatment. Um, Always, trust psychotherapists that have done their own work. If you do work for a facility or yourself, consider scheduling time off to recalibrate and ground if you do feel you're becoming reactive to the just collective mass violence that either you're witnessing, experiencing, or if your caseload keeps bringing up these events, especially if you're around where a recent event has happened. Another best practice is to consider stating in your consent form the boundaries on what behaviors will not be tolerated within your professional space between clients and personnel. Like using myself as an example, I have it simply stated, please don't audio or video record our sessions. I also have it stated on the other end of the spectrum, please don't welcome anyone else to our sessions that we haven't made prior arrangements with. And if anyone's ever worked in DV, that happens every once in a while where the partner kind of wants to come into the session unannounced. So that's just little examples from my own caseload. Always be privy to the emergency exit plan in place for your office space. So, know where the exits are, know how to leave the facility, know how to get to safety or your car, okay? Discuss these matters openly with clients and with colleagues. So as Dr. Kalman was reflecting, this can be a very isolating practice. We are often passing ships in the night amongst our colleagues. We may, for example, use the same space, but not see these people. So scheduling check-ins with colleagues and just consciously talking about our safety plans, that really helps it become just normalized in the conversation. Because if mass violence is becoming normalized, it behooves us to normalize safety and preparedness. Also, too, directly from the United States Department of Labor, I would check out, and I have it hyperlinked here, just policies on workplace violence. These are just federal guidelines and policies on how to manage it. So it bears repeating, especially with California clinicians, Tarasoff and personal safety and navigating the two. So as a reminder, California clinicians are bound by Tarasoff. What's Tarasoff? So in Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California in '76, the California Supreme Court held that mental health providers, such as us, have an obligation to protect persons who could be harmed by a patient. So it's really beneficial, which we're going to do right now, is to review what our duties to protect and what our duties to warn are. So the duty to warn refers to a therapist's obligation to warn identifiable victims. So people who the person has stated they plan to harm, okay? Our duty to protect is a psychotherapist's duty to reveal confidential client information if the therapist has reason to believe that a third party may be harmed. Okay. So another question to chew on: what happens when we clinicians are afraid or have been threatened? How do we vacillate between these two duties that we have? And an added bonus: what if an already at-risk client wants to acquire a firearm? Well, I did some consultation with a colleague well-versed in this area. So Dr. Richard Labrie, as a clinical psychologist trained in crisis response and direct suicide prevention, he's also done research on mass shootings and insider threats for the Department of Homeland Security's FAA. So think about it. Does acquiring a firearm count as lethal means? Well, from Dr. Labrie in electronic communication back and forth, he noted that aside from our basic duties to report, protect, and such, California AB 1014, which is a new law, allows clinicians, much like family members, coworkers, and others in a person's environment, to call your local police and express concern. A court may then issue a restraining order that not only can allow law enforcement to retrieve weapons temporarily, but can also block the purchase of a weapon if the person is planning to do so. So this is one of those moments where, does protecting ourselves breach confidentiality? In my opinion, and again, this is not legal advice or supervision, well, in my opinion, lawfully acquiring a firearm to me counts as lethal means if I were doing an HI assessment. Because think about it, there's a difference when doing homicidal assessment. Let's say the patient identifies someone they want to harm, they tell you their plan, but the plan is, on Tuesday, I'm going to kill my wife by shooting a hate beam out of my eyeballs. Not really lethal means, but that does, in my clinical experience, if I knew a client was already at high risk of violence towards someone else, they endorsed a plan and identified a person, and they were talking about their means, and if they happen to acquire a firearm, in my book, that counts as lethal means for sure. And I think that already trumps AB 1014, and that falls into our duty to protect and our duty to warn. That's just my opinion. So another realm that's specific to us, we should be privy to gun deaths for kids and teens. So it should be noted that gun violence is the leading cause of death for kids and teens in the United States. And guns cause over 3,500 child and teenage deaths each year. So in the realms that we are already trained to assess for homicidality, guns are used with 60% of the time. With suicidality, guns are used with 35% of the time. And again, both suicidality and homicidality are well within our scope of practice as mental health clinicians. But again, the reason we're having this talk is assessing for all of this and just absorbing this vicarious trauma can really take a toll. So what are some of the common reactions we may hear from both our clients and may experience in ourselves? Well, remember that it's feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, feelings of irritability, languish, malaise, lethargy, or a lack of feelings altogether, negative self-talk due to lowered productivity or a disconnect from others, feeling numb, foggy, devoid of affect, or feelings of depersonalization or derealization. And I think my trauma-informed colleagues will understand those too. Suffice it to say, post-traumatic stress symptoms such as sleep issues, intrusive negative thoughts and memories, avoiding internal or external triggers, feeling on edge or fearful, or feeling guilt, which includes survivor guilt. Some other negative experiences we all may feel in reaction to mass violence is losing oneself in doom scrolling, such as spending hours on social media consuming content that really only permeates or even worsens our mood after. So some of the tips to wrestle with this provider and first responder self-care and to apply these tips and skills, first and foremost, have a professional plan in place for if mass violence occurs on the job. That also crosswalks to have a personal plan in place with loved ones in the event that mass violence happens when you're out in the world. For us as psychotherapists, obtaining training or brushing up on grief counseling, trauma focused and resilience focused therapy interventions really benefits us. Again, as psychotherapists, schedule self check ins and also remember to schedule check ins with your colleagues. Um, Consider having or increasing one's own psychotherapy frequency or medication management. It's also always good to just practice what we preach. And as clinicians, it's really behooves us to educate ourselves on the pathway to violence. So, such as observing and learning what warning behaviors are, such as an individual receiving grievances, identifying enemies, drafting hit lists, um, assessing for suicidality and homicidality, and identifying the violent path from research and planning to the preparation stage. Again, it just benefits us all to at least be privy to these things. If we spot it in our caseload, it's not saying we have to treat it, but maybe we'll have that eye for that so we can refer to the appropriate colleague who can manage this. So one piece of benefit that helps us both as a clinician and as just a person is these two info sheets that I want to tell you about. So over the past 2 decades, Professor Emily Diamond, who is the director of the Health Inequality Studies, has compiled her clinical experiences and research into care sheets on both taking care of ourselves in the midst of violence and taking care of ourselves in troubled times. Following are some highlights of these works, which are again available free of charge at healthinequalitystudies.org under the Our Work tab. And this is the independent research group that I belong to myself. So again, these tips are snippets of what those two info sheets have. First and foremost, managing our distress and our paranoia, and also modeling this for our patients. So helping our clients understand the difference between preparedness and paranoia is where we start. Preparedness is having a plan to help mitigate feelings of distress. Paranoia is just permeating the distress that's already there. It really benefits us to motivate our clients to begin developing a plan on what to do if they're caught in mass violence, also helping us define that. And we need to consider our own violence diet or budget on how much we consume for entertainment and how much risk we're allowing to assume when we go into public. So in conjunction with our work, our wonderful psychotherapy that we already provide, it benefits us to explore clients starting medication management with a psychiatrist to address any clinical issues such as post-traumatic stress. Like for example, if a patient is dealing with post-traumatic stress, they may be dealing with night terrors or sleep disturbances. And a psychiatrist, for example, or what I've observed in my clinical work, being on treatment teams, a psychiatrist might prescribe Prazosin or a sleep aid to help them stay asleep. And that's just something we as clinical psychologists, are not able to provide. So that's why, again, it behooves us to create a solid treatment team for the patients. And this also demonstrates the pathway to receiving services for ourselves as clinicians. And again, as psychotherapists, it really is beneficial to brush up on grief therapy and trauma-based interventions that are also compatible with resilience-based interventions. That's the adage of trauma-based interventions, really focusing on how to accept what's happened, then develop resiliency. That's really what helps crystallize and helps our clients move on, especially in light of just being around mass violence or maybe experiencing it or witnessing it. So some of the steps, once one has already maybe drafted a plan or just educated themselves on mass violence and some of the safety awareness and just mindful techniques, the next step for some people, those a little more extroverted, find benefits of being proactive and taking action. So for example, we can research how to obtain gun restraining orders in our state. In California, we have now gun restraining orders in effect, and the hyperlink here will take you to Governor Newsom's description of that. As psychotherapists, we can also educate ourselves on how consumers can sue firearm manufacturers. That is a new real thing now. It's not so much, oh, I'm suing you because you sold me a gun and the gun can kill people. It's really on the fact that guns are sold, some guns are sold a little willy-nilly, such that they're able to be augmented into an illegal form of a firearm. So they're technically enabling the committing of a crime, or at least that's my understanding, not as an attorney with that. But again, that's why it bears, to educate ourselves on this. As a psychotherapist, or we can motivate our clients to write to elected representatives. And there's a little hyperlink here from the ACLU, which beautifully describes how to write to an elected official. Also being proactive, you can attend or support peaceful demonstrations to express your concerns with like-minded folks. And also you can support your clients doing the same. And as clinicians, we can do some of our own research and inform our colleagues on what findings we come about. Also, for us as psychotherapists, it's really beneficial to filter our online consumption. So as providers, it does behoove us to stay informed on current events, and we don't always have the luxury of turning off media altogether. So as we develop our provider's self-care violence budget or violence diet, we can include setting timers before we go on social media. That's a good way to stop us. Any of the trauma-informed clinicians know how much time systematic desensitization takes, so they can, apply that time frame as well. Our violence diet should also include using news sources that are deemed trustworthy, unbiased, and reputable. So my little rubric on if I'm trying to determine if a source is, reputable, I ask myself, would I cite this source in a scholarly paper, for example? Or when news anchors give a trigger warning to their audiences, I actually listen and ask myself if my violence budget has space to watch the tragedy that's being discussed. There's a difference between hearing about it and seeing it. And I think as psychotherapists, we can appreciate the difference between hearing a narrative and actually witnessing it. We can also ask ourselves if we're consuming violence for education or for entertainment. We can also try to identify and adjust anti-doom scrolling by making efforts to strike that conscious balance between staying informed while not falling down a rabbit hole of mindless scrolling on our devices. And one of the biggest symptoms that you hear people report in reaction to mass violence, it's numbness or depersonalization or derealization. So people who are more MBSR informed in their clinical work will know that the antidote to numbness is mindfulness. So help yourself and your clients develop mindful practices to combat any feelings of numbness, detachment, jadedness, or overall desensitization. So some of the techniques I like to use in my clinical practice are like focus on the colors you see, especially on mindful walks, mindfulness with eating an orange, or I've also seen people do it with a Jolly Rancher if you're cool with high fructose sugar. Again, using mindful walks just to get a person out there, and also mindful walks can emulate some of the techniques in EMDR, moving your eyes back and forth, taking in the scenes when you're doing a walk. Guided audio meditations, because I know sometimes just telling a person to sit down and just clear their mind just doesn't work. And that models it for our clients as well. Also encouraging your clients to do yoga. I mean, this is Los Angeles, so yoga is pretty popular here, so lean into it. Also trying to learn loving kindness and self-compassion mantras to combat feelings of languish, ease, and negative thinking patterns. Again, that helps us as clinicians, and it helps us model that for the people we work with and the people who trust their mental health in our hands. I also just want to encourage some resources specifically for coping with violence. We have the APA's note on mass shootings and violence tips and tools. We also have the APA's resources for coping with mass violence directly. We have the FBI's active shooter resources on what to do specifically in the event you're caught in mass violence. I also just love the title here. We have Gays Against Guns, which is an LGBTQ plus organization against gun violence. We also have the resource here of how to talk to our kids about school shootings. Also, I have to give special time to the Rebels Project, which is one of the beautiful alchemist things that came out of the awful Columbine shootings that happened, on April 20th, 1999. Many of the survivors of that event formed a coalition that they call the Rebels Project because their mascot was the rebel. And they've been able to turn this pain and this trauma into something that helps others. So always like to give them an extra shout out. Also, SAMHSA has been really great with resources. Also directly from the Department of Homeland Security, we have Run, Hide, Fight, which is also how to deal if you're in the event of an active shooting. SAMHSA also has another resource under that. And then, always keeping it inclusive and intersectional. How do we talk to people of color about gun violence? Well, that resources is here as well. Again, tips specifically for parents and teachers on how to talk to kids about violence, talking about child trauma, and just the Victim Connect Resource Center, which is where I got my information on how many shootings have happened this year up to right now. Also, I've compiled the research from Run, Hide, Fight and FBI's active shooter list into a digestible info sheet. This is a companion to this talk, and it helps you develop both your plan for what to do if you're caught in violence and also how to develop a violence budget on keeping ourselves even keeled amidst all this violence. So the code to get that free of charge is right here. It's also been provided in the chat box. So my closing thoughts are that guiding clients to process their reactions to mass violence can take a really heavy toll on our own health and mental well-being as healthcare providers. So this talk explored and normalized the various reactions both we and our clients may have to mass violence, along with skills and resources on how to better cope. These frequent acts of domestic terrorism impact our personal mental health and society at large in various ways. And learning to better understand and apply the skills explored in this talk can help us find balance to both receive and provide support. And of course, references. We love science. And if anyone wants to follow my journey on providing this information, all of my information is here, which you can take a picture of, screenshot, or just take off of the slides if you do download the slide deck.